Hello and welcome to the Three Books from Hearts and Minds podcast. My name is Phil and I work for the Coalition for Christian Outreach, the CCO, where we're a campus ministry transforming college students to transform the world. I'm happy to co-host today's episode of Three Books from Hearts and Minds podcast with, of course, the host with the most to say about the books you should be reading, Byron Borger of Hearts and Minds Bookstore. Byron, how are you doing today? And what is your favorite part of my favorite month, the month of October?
Phil, your introduction is always so energetic. I feel like I should be shot out of a cannon or something at a circus. So this is really fun. Thanks to our listeners out there that are checking out this podcast. I'm glad you like October. I like October a lot too. I have something I like about every month except maybe one, but almost every month I like. But I like October a lot. But rather than saying the cliched things about, I don't know, leaves and crisp, pumpkins and stuff, I think I'm going to say that James Taylor, who I really, really like, again, it might sound like a cliche, but James Taylor is a great artist, has an album called October Road. And there's a song about October in there that's very, very nice. My other another great top couple musical influences is the band U2. And before they got all atmospheric and arena, beautiful stuff, The Streets Have No Name. In their early days, they were pretty punk, and they had a punk kind of album called October. They were kids. So James Taylor's October and U2's October. That's my favorite October stuff.
That's amazing. October is my favorite month. It's my birthday comes at the end of the month. The baseball playoffs now, the Phillies just lost last night, which is soul crushing to me.
That's right.
Just soul crushing. But the baseball playoffs, I'm a big baseball guy, as we've discussed many times before on this podcast. And I love all the pumpkin pie used to be my favorite food, let alone favorite dessert. And I've got stories around that being my favorite food. And so I just delight in October for all the cliche reasons too. The autumn leaves, I
Yeah.
love sweater weather, right?
Yeah.
So and one thing that I think you'll appreciate is actually October might be, and hear me out, October might be the month that I read the least because of the baseball playoffs being every evening, right? There's a baseball game of great importance, and I just love it. But I also begin to sincerely think about a plan for the winter, and winter is probably when I read the most. And so I often mix it up with some fiction or with some topics I haven't dug into yet. But that's my transition from October into the winter. We today have a transition from October to November, and I believe you've got some books on how to engage as a citizen in the climate that comes with the month of November. Am I right, Byron?
Yes, at least this November, particularly with the elections coming up, lots of people are thinking, well, as citizens, as
hmm
Christians, about our public theology and our votes as they may be for a variety of candidates on a variety of topics, from dog catcher to mayor to the presidential elections. I don't want to talk as a partisan advocate. I could if you let me, but I could talk about my own passions about the things going haywire this particular election cycle. But rather, I'd like to highlight just a couple of books that are pretty generic about, and I don't mean that in a bad way, that are good for
Right.
any time. This isn't to like bone up in the next 2 weeks about who to vote for, but how we kind of after this election take a breath and think about the long-term commitment of public life as Christians and as citizens in a republic that has a democracy. To be given the great gift of voting is in history sort of a unique thing, and so we have to steward that well. So what it means to kind of develop a Christian perspective in the polarization and the politics might be helpful. I'm teaching a class in my Sunday school at my church. It's been on Zoom. It's been on a YouTube Live and stuff, Facebook. Starting in the fall and going up all the way up to Advent. So I've been thinking about this
Wow.
tons
Yeah. Good.
theologically and biblically about the nature of the state and the nature of citizenship. But I got 3 books today to tell you about 3 different, very different sorts of books, and would love to transition into talking about November.
Lead us right into it, Byron.
All right, the first one I'm going to talk about, and by the way, if this interests you at all, my book notes newsletter that I do almost every week has 5 categories of books about politics, and they're basically 5 levels, from the most basic, introductory, brief, easy to read ones, all the way up to serious political philosophy, and some stuff about the current nationalism and some of the hot button concerns about the far alt right these days, the KKK and all that stuff. So I've gone from basic to serious to some specific topics in my book notes newsletter. So you could always explore those and the extra discounts we're offering there. But here for these three from Hearts and Minds, I'm going to start with one by a guy named Joshua Butler. Butler is a fascinating writer. He wrote a book years ago called The Skeleton in God's Closet, which was sort of archaeology and apologetics of whether or not Jesus rose from the dead, and some really interesting, fascinating, thoughtful apologetics. He's a culturally savvy guy that pays attention to theology and culture. He's written some other things. Some people have liked him, some people haven't, but he's a respectable, thoughtful writer. His new book is called The Party Crasher. The Party Crasher. The subtitle is Why Jesus Disrupts Politics as Usual and Redeems Our Partisan Divides. Can Jesus be the one that is the party crasher that gets us away from our loyalties to a partisan ideology, left, right, or center, and moves us to some other way of thinking about the church and politics? So this is a kind of introductory level, although it's not cheesy, it's not simplistic. It is kind of fun to read. I really like it because one of the things he does here is instead of taking a kind of binary left to right continuum, you're liberal or you're conservative or somewhere in the middle, he has one of those four-sided quadrants. Is there a name for those? Those kind of business quadrants. And so you can be up in the right, or you can be down in the right, or you can be up in the left or down in the left. So there's four quadrants, and he has four sort of positions where typical secular ideologies tend to place themselves. And then he asks in what way they are consistent with a biblical ideal or not, and whether Christians might find something useful in those quadrants. And then when you look at all four together, where do you find yourself? The up and down levels, by the way, he calls modern and postmodern. And the left and right he calls politically liberal and politically conservative, or left and right. But rather than just left and right, he has this modern, postmodern thing going on. So it has this sort of the commitment to progress in the upper left, responsibility in the far right. He has security concerns in the lower right and identity concerns in the lower left. It doesn't make a lot of sense until you actually see the chart. But once you see it, you go like, oh, I get it. And there's certain slogans that tend to go along with that, like your identity in the postmodern left would be like live your own truth. In the modern right would be sort of pull yourself up by your own bootstraps. In the postmodern uh, liberal left, it's like you can change the world. But in the other quadrant, it's like good fences make good neighbors, he says. So he's got these sort of four quadrants, and he works through all four of those. It's not complicated, although the way I'm describing it sounds a little wacky. But when you look at the quadrants and the four corners, you can kind of fall yourself into at one place or another within those, somewhat to the left and somewhat to the up or the down. It's really good. He calls them four political religions. He says these are almost so encoded in the deepest convictions people have about the life, we might call them in the CCO worldviews. Four worldviews that can be kind of captured in these four quadrants, and then the politics that goes along with those. In the second chapter, after explaining all that, he has a pledge of allegiance to the King of Kings. And he invites people literally to sign on to this. Discussion questions are fascinating. He says, welcome to the king's table. And he talks about what the king is offering, a feast and a meal. He gives 10 political commandments that he calls us to. And some of them are common sense, to be courteous and civil. And others are more surprising and distinctively Christian. So anyway, he says we have to be bold but gentle. We have to be sort of prophetic in our analysis of the cultural vibes that are out there, the ethos of these different movements, but we find ourselves in the middle among them. And so how do you sort of be distinctive as Christians, as Christ followers? And the main chief point, of course, is this: Jesus is a party crasher. He's coming in no matter where you stand. He's inviting you to his table, calling on allegiance to his kingdom. And once you're loyal to Jesus's kingdom, then everything else sort of can fit into place. And you can kind of be discerning and in but not of, as Jesus put it in John 17, in but not of the world, in but not of your political party. And you may not even want to stay in your political party because you find yourself maybe a little here and a little there, and it's a complicated, messy world we live in politically and ideologically. So anyway, the party crasher, he disrupts our loyalties. If you've got some kind of worldly loyalty to this or that radio talk show host or this liberal or conservative news source, he says, no, 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 you got to be committed to Jesus. And he helps you be aligned with him, gives you some commandments for our civil life, as he calls them, and then invites us to a robust kingdom vision of following Jesus everywhere, including into the voting booth. So I really like this book a lot. And he looks at these ideologies and says, once you understand them as almost religions, you won't want to get too cozy with any of them. But yet you'll want to understand them as they deeply are, not just sort of candidates, but worldviews that drive the ethos and the values of a whole kind of movement. And it's not just one or two, liberal and conservative. There's more to the picture than just that. It's a fun book. It's an easy book. It's not complicated, although I'm making it sound that way, but it really flows very nicely. Joshua Ryan Butler, The Party Crasher. It's my first one to suggest.
Yeah, it sounds amazing. One thing my mind kept floating to was the personality test or the strengths test that we take as individuals when we become part of a new organization or workplace or whatever, and how getting some labels on some of the facets of our own personality
Oh,
end up
that's good.
affirming a lot of things, but also challenging a lot of things. And the two thoughts I had here was it sounds like the labels help us name things so that we can say, "Oh, this is what's going on here, and this is where my part in it, where I fall in it." But the other thought I had was, isn't an election just one big corporate personality test in a certain way too, where I feel like these labels would actually help us in our discourse of the personality test of America and say, "Oh, this is what's going on here. Or this is why this political party has this leaning." So even just the language and anytime you can get things on a graph, this is coming from a guy with a math degree, so of course I'm going to love a XY axis graph, but anytime you can start placing things on a graph, it just gives us all kind of a baseline language to interact with others, whether we agree with them, align with them, or not. So I'm already fascinated by what you're lending there, even in its complex form. I think it's
Very
something
well
that will
put.
really help us.
Very well put, Phil. You are understanding this book exactly. You called it an XY axis graph. Is that what it's called?
That's right. Yeah,
Yeah. See,
yeah. X is the
I
horizontal.
knew you. For what it's worth, it's a chapter near the end of this book called "Formational Practices for a Polarized World." Given the XY graph, given the complex personality things he names, and you're right, he's given them a name so you can kind of work with it, whether you like it or don't like it, whether you agree with it or don't like it. But it gives you some ways to sort of see these graphs. He then says, what are the practices that will shape us in the ways of Jesus? So from the inside out, we can be transformed in this polarized world, but not add to the noise. We can be distinctive and thoughtful and caring and gracious, even as we renounce some of the stuff that we see out there. So those formational practices are worth the price of the book as well. It's really useful. I thought this was just one more. There's so many Christian books on politics now. This is published by Multnomah, which is an evangelical, thoughtful Christian publishing house, conservative evangelical. And I thought, what's it going to be? But I like Butler. And then I thought, holy smokes, this is a great book. So I was surprised by this little book. It's really, really good. Here's
That's
the
great.
next one. And when you name personality types, Phil, and our strength finders and those kind of tests, this is exactly what the next book does. This too offers us some names, less for the ideologies that are out there, but more for our own dispositions and how we tend to enter political discourse in this polarized days. It is a book called The After Party. The After Party Towards a Better Christian Politics is by Curtis Chang and Nancy French. I could talk too long about both of these guys who I admire immensely. Nancy French wrote one of the most moving memoirs I've read in years. Earlier this year, she was a pretty far right political activist, as was her husband, worked for the National Review. She was a biographer of a number of pretty far right political candidates. They adopted an African American child, and people sort of turned on them, got really viciously ugly, and she's had to leave with great sadness in many ways. Many of her ultra conservative friends on the far right. She finds herself in a moderate position now, and man, the people on the Trumpian right are really mad at her. So you may have heard of her husband, David French, or Nancy French, because of their high-profile Christian leadership in the pretty conservative movement years ago, and how they've now been outspoken and calling for a less ideological, less politically driven, partisan driven, for a more open, kind of gracious approach, not unlike the party crasher. So that's Nancy French. The other guy is Curtis Chang, who used to work in campus ministry for InterVarsity. He wrote a book years ago on reaching postmodern young adults by using Aquinas and Augustine. So, like, why in the world you would say to approach postmodern hipster kids to reach them with the gospel in these days, you would go back to these ancient theologians. But man, that book on apologetics was brilliant on Aquinas and Augustine. So he's a pretty sharp theological dude, but he's segued in his own vocation and career in recent decades to become a counselor. So he's a psychologist and a trained therapist. His most recent book is on anxiety. So you got this therapist that's rooted in the deepest theological traditions. You have this political operative and writer who has got a past in being very well known in certain political circles. The two of them got together and said there is just so much polarization these days that we've got to do something about it. And so they've created this curriculum that David French helped with. And this is the book that you can use with the curriculum, whether you use the curriculum or not. The book, The After Party, attempts to name, get this, different personality types and their tendencies and how they tend to engage public policy issues and political debates. Here are the categories that they talk about. Just for instance, you can see the chapter titles. After saying, we're all invited to this party, we're Americans, we're Christians, we're welcome at the table. Anybody, no matter who you are, come on in. But there's different kinds of people. One is the combatant. It's a person that wants to argue, wants to win the argument, wants to smash and own the other side, etc. Whether that's a distinctively Christ-like tone and posture, you may wonder. And they of course suggest that that's not necessarily the combatant isn't the way to go. They look at the exhausted, people that are just tired of the debate and exhausted, and they come at things kind of frustratingly. I feel that way sometimes. They have one called the disciple. They have one called the cynic, who tends to think about politics always in the worst possible light because they're cynical about everybody. They invite folks to like work on these four grids: the disciple, the combatant, the exhausted, and the cynic, and compare those sort of personality types, if you will, on the ways in which we tend to be the knee-jerk reaction to political debates. Isn't that interesting that they use sort of a personality style? And again, I'm thinking this is Curtis Chang, the therapist's insight that personality styles can be sort of translated into certain public personas, if you will, and the way we tend to react cynically or combatantly or uh, with anxiety and exhaustion. So they're asking, how can we learn to be more Christ-like and let go of some of our cynicism or our combating styles and impulses, and rather learn to put love first, the human side first, the gracious appeal to give the benefit of the doubt to others, the golden rule. I mean, this isn't rocket science, but they say this kind of attitude of the golden rule and Christian care, instead of these impulses that we tend to have, if we replace them with true Christ-like process, our polarization in our conversation could be transformed. It's a brilliant book. It's less about policy. It's not so much what Christians should think about the ideologies and the worldviews behind things, the way Joshua Ryan Butler proposed. It's more like our process of how we get there. What do you do? What's the way in which you engage others? Can you have a conversation over turkey dinner in November at Thanksgiving with with people who have different political views amongst your most intimate friends? And they say there's a real problem in America because friends and family and intimate people, churches, are breaking up over these impulses we have to put partisan politics over the principles of care and compassion. So it's not just saying to tone down and be nice. It's not just that. but he does offer a pretty interesting grid to understand the personalities involved and our impulses and postures, and invites us to humility and hope. That's the stuff that they said. We need a humility and we need hope. Isn't that interesting?
It's great. I was reflecting on the 2 podcast episodes ago, the last one you and I recorded together. Marty Solomon has some stuff around Jesus interacting with the Essenes and the Pharisees and the Sadducees, these different parties and their different strengths, in the Jewish political structures of the time when Jesus was around. And the disciples would have seen Jesus interacting with them differently, but inviting all of them into this kingdom movement. It sounds like this book is a modern treatise on the same thing. How do we interact and follow Jesus in the midst of these different personalities, these different ideologies,
Yeah.
and go towards something deeper, knowing these personality types, knowing these ideologies and how they mix into that. And then I think you referred to French's memoir in our memoir episode as well,
Oh,
back
I
over this
might have.
summer. And
I
so
might
we
have.
had mentioned French before.
Yeah.
So there's some allusions to even some of our other episodes. And if I think about it, I'll make sure they're in the show notes below in the description as well. But yeah, so we've got about 5 more minutes. Can you get us to our last book there, Byron?
Yeah. Well, the next one follows suit. Both of these are easy to read. They're fun, actually. I mean, they might probe you a little, but if you got a thick skin, they're fun, they're interesting, lots of stories, lots of examples, lots of passion, and not too long and not too hard. This next one is going to be a different shift for a different kind of reader. This one is no nonsense. It doesn't offer a lot of great stories, although he does, and not a lot of pizzazz. This guy lowers the level to a scholarly sort of, let's analyze what it means to be a Christian citizen that's aligned to loyal to the kingdom of God first above all, and what that might look like. The book is called Citizenship Without Illusions: A Christian Guide to Political Involvement by David Koyzis. Now, Koyzis, you should know, is a political theorist. He's been in Canada, Redeemer in Ontario. He's good friends with Al Walters, for instance, that we in the CC know. Oh, you know his reformational book, Creation Regained. He knows Calvin Serville. So he's in this sort of Dutch Reformed, Kuyperian, neo Calvinist movement that wants to claim every square inch of creation for Christ. He's also a political theorist. And so, on the academic level, his earlier book was against the ideologies that shape political discourse in the West. And he suggests that liberalism and conservatism, far left Marxism and far right libertarianism, they all come from the same roots from the time of the Enlightenment. This, the revolt in France, where the Enlightenment secularists wanted to squash the church and take down all the street signs that had names from saints on them and stuff, and change the names. They even changed the calendar because the calendar was based on how many years it was since Jesus. So they went back to year one, as they called it in the French Revolution. So the French Revolution was this militant revolutionary movement that gave rise to both the conservative right and the liberal left in Western American political discourse. Most of us don't know that the liberal left and the political right are kissing cousins, rooted in John Locke and others that got their marching orders from the French Revolution. So his study of the French Revolution and how ideologies develop, which are idols with legs, the idols that we make into collective or personal freedom, that these become idols and they distort our understanding of reality, which cause us illusions. So his book on ideologies and illusions is really heavy and brilliant. For years, people would say this book on brilliant analysis of culture and the French Revolution and so on is so thoughtful and interesting, but it's kind of dense. Could you write a simpler one that explains to ordinary people how you be a good citizen in light of that? If you're not aligned with either the right or the left, both of the books I had mentioned previously mention this guy. So he is behind the scenes in many of our best thinkers these days. He's balanced, he's thoughtful, he's passionate about justice, but public justice for all, not just sort of social justice as liberals might describe it. He's really hard to pin down because he's just so multifaceted and has such a good picture of things. So this book is him explaining, as he does often in his political science classes at the Redeemer, what it looks like to be a Christian citizen. Besides the non-aligned thing, and the responsibility of the citizens in a modern day state. Not everybody has the privilege of citizenship in a modern state, but he asks what a state is, what a government is, what a citizen is, and then what are our duties under God before Christ to be faithful in but not of a political party. So he's asking these really practical questions. And beside the non aligned thing that we're distinctively Christian and not left or right, the second big thing is citizenship is more than voting every 4 years for a new president or prime minister. That there's sort of a daily public ethos that should guide our neighborly commitment to the common good that puts us in touch with organizations and institutions and the calling of statecraft. We're not all called to be political experts, and we're not all called to be political office holders, but we are all citizens. And so, day by day, just like we're not all artists, but we care about creativity, we're not all bankers, but we manage our money, we're not all called to politics, but we are all citizens. So there's some sense in which we've got a daily duty to live into the common life of our neighborhoods and our governments, no matter where we live, our states and our regions. So politics for him, citizenship, I should say, for him, is more than just voting, and it's more than just national, international politics. He does look at national stuff a bit, but he also invites us just to be good citizens in the day by day. Not a dramatic read, not a heavy, spiffy, exciting read, but I'll tell you what, in many ways, it could be the most important book I think we've got for a balanced, ordinary approach to Christians who want to think well about public life and our citizenship and the importance of both local and national and global relationships and the role of the church in society. Good stuff. David Koyzis, Citizenship Without Illusions. It is so new that it's not even out yet officially, but we've got it. The publisher said we can sell them. InterVarsity Press, brand spanking new, and it is, in a certain sense, what to do after the election as we move forward to think well in the years to come what it means to be a better citizen.
That's great. Shout out to staff person Jim Hagan, who I was talking to this morning, who works in the DC area. He said, I bet Byron is going to talk about this book. And it was that book right there, Citizenship Without Illusions. So he's on to you, Byron, and he's on to that book. And I think that's just a great way to kind of tie a bow on this episode, is that, both the hearts and minds vision, the CCO vision of transforming college students to transform the world is one of engagement, right? You were talking about the cynic and the tired, right? The fatigue around all this. But that's not the Christian call. The Christian call is not to just fly away someday into the clouds and escape all this. It's to engage and engage even in the messiest, most in our face parts of the world, like it is as we transition from October to November here. So I appreciate that recommendation, and so does Jim, as well as the other recommendations here. Anything else you want to do to tie a bow on our episode here today, Byron?
Well, again, just because the elections are so spicy these days, and Christians have embarrassed ourselves across the board in many ways, this and that. I'm not being partisan. I'm just saying we need a coherent kind of consensus on a Christian way to engage. And I think these kind of books are good starters to an ongoing conversation that we have to have about public justice and our role as American citizens or Canadian citizens moving forward. So this isn't a flash in the pan. Let's figure out who to vote for and win or lose, and then let it go for another 4 years. We need to be working now so we have a more articulate witness in the years to come. And so, as ordinary citizens, it's just like parenting in a certain sense. You don't just show up once a year and discipline your kid. It's a day to day
Sure.
relationship that unfolds and develops over time. And that too is what our citizenship needs to be. So, if you're into politics, you're going to love these books. If you're not, you need them. We're all citizens. God calls us to engage, and these books are ways, pretty painless ways, to begin to think it through. I'd recommend buying a couple and getting some friends after the election and commit yourself to thinking this through better so we have a good witness in the years to come.
Amen. That's great. Well, thank you so much for listening to another episode of the Three Books from Hearts and Minds podcast. All books mentioned in this episode are 20% off if you order them. The first thing that you'll see in the show description below, whatever platform you're listening on, will be the order form for ordering these books from Hearts and Minds. And we'd really appreciate it if you shared this episode, if you liked it and left a great review. so that we can get these episodes into the hands of others. And of course, not only do we want you to order these books, read the books, right? We want to engage with the material here, and you can engage with us. Our email addresses will be in the show description as well. So thanks again for listening to another episode of the Three Books from Hearts and Minds podcast.